Stay home. My wife only wants her own family there. My son's message appeared on my phone while I was standing at the kitchen counter, holding a printed itinerary I had spent weeks putting together for what I thought would be our first real family vacation in years. I read it once. Then again. Slowly. As if the words might rearrange themselves into something kinder if I gave them enough time. They didn't. I set the paper down beside the sink, right next to the envelope where I had neatly organized every confirmation, flights, hotel suites, excursions I had carefully chosen because I knew what each of them liked. I didn't reply. I didn't call. I simply placed my phone face down and stood there in the quiet of my home, the hum of the refrigerator suddenly louder than it had ever been. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and tell me where you're listening from. I'd like to know how far this story travels. Just 2 days earlier, I had been sitting at this same table with a cup of tea gone cold, double-checking the booking for the oceanfront resort in Florida. 3 bedrooms, one for my son and his wife, one for the grandchildren, and a smaller one for me at the end of the hall. I had smiled when I picked that room. I won't need much, I'd told myself. Just to be close. At 71, you learn not to take up too much space, even in your own family. My late husband used to say I overdid things, that I gave too much. But after he passed, the house became unbearably quiet, and these little acts, planning trips, sending gifts, cooking meals no one asked for, became my way of still feeling like I belonged somewhere. The dining room still carried his presence. The oak table we bought 32 years ago sat polished and ready, though no one had eaten there in weeks. His chair remained slightly pulled back, as if he had just stepped away for a moment and might return any second with that gentle smile of his. I glanced at it now, instinctively, as though he might offer me an explanation for what I had just read. But of course, there was only silence. My son hadn't always been like this. There was a time when he would call just to tell me about his day, when he'd stop by unannounced with takeout and insist I sit while he handled dinner. But things had shifted slowly after he got married. Not all at once, never all at once. It was small things at first. Missed calls. Shorter visits. Holidays that needed to be balanced. I told myself it was normal. That this was what happened when children built lives of their own. Still, I had held on to the belief that when it truly mattered, when it was family, when it was something meaningful, I would be included. That message on my phone told me otherwise. I walked over to the window and looked out at the quiet street, the same street where my son used to ride his bicycle in wide, wobbly circles while I stood on the porch, clapping every time he made it back without falling. I had cheered for every milestone, every small victory in his life. And now, here I was, being asked, no, told, to stay home. Not because there wasn't room. Not because I couldn't afford it. But because I wasn't wanted. And the cruelest part wasn't even the exclusion. It was the fact that I had paid for all of it. The house felt even quieter that evening, as if the walls themselves had heard the message and decided to step back, leaving me alone with it. I didn't turn on the lights right away. I just sat in the living room, the fading orange glow of the sunset stretching across the floor, stopping just short of my feet. It had been 3 days since I finalized every reservation for that trip. 3 days since I carefully reviewed each detail, making sure everything was perfect, not extravagant, just thoughtful. I had chosen that particular resort because my granddaughter once mentioned she loved the ocean, the way the waves sounded at night. I had booked a dolphin tour because my grandson had a phase where he watched marine documentaries every afternoon after school. Even the restaurant reservations had been made with care, one seafood place for my son, who always preferred grilled fish, and a small Italian spot for his wife, because she once said she missed real pasta like the kind she had growing up. I remembered all of it. I always remembered. That's what mothers do. But somewhere along the way, it seemed like no one remembered me. I finally reached over and switched on the lamp beside me. The soft light revealed the folder still sitting on the coffee table, slightly open, the edges of the printed confirmations peeking out like something unfinished. I leaned forward and picked it up again, flipping through each page slowly this time, not as a planner, but as someone trying to understand how something so carefully built could be dismissed with a single sentence. The total at the bottom of the last page stared back at me. It wasn't a small number. Not for someone like me. I had dipped into savings I once told myself I'd only use for emergencies. And maybe this was one. Not the kind you call 911 for, but the kind that quietly changes how you see the people you love. My phone buzzed again on the table. For a moment, I thought it might be him. Maybe another message. Maybe an apology. I let it ring once. Twice. Then I picked it up. It was a bank notification, confirming one of the larger charges had fully processed. I stared at it longer than I needed to, then let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Funny how something as simple as a notification could feel like confirmation of something deeper. Not just that I had paid for the trip, but that I had invested in a version of family that no longer included me. I stood up slowly and walked back into the kitchen, the same place where I had read his message earlier. The itinerary was still there, exactly where I had left it. I picked it up again, smoothing out a small crease along the edge. My hands were steady now. Not because I felt better, but because something inside me had shifted. The confusion was gone. The questioning, the maybe I misunderstood, the maybe she didn't mean it that way, all of that had settled into something clearer. Something colder. I walked to the sink, turned on the faucet, and let the water run for a moment before placing the papers beneath it. The ink began to blur almost immediately, the carefully printed details dissolving into soft blue streaks that ran down into the drain. Flights. Cancelable. Hotel. Refundable within 48 hours. Excursions. Paid in full, but still within the window. I knew every clause. Every deadline. I had made sure of that when I booked it. Not because I expected something to go wrong, but because life had taught me that it sometimes does. I turned off the water and watched the last traces of ink disappear. Then I folded the damp pages and set them aside. I didn't cry. I didn't sit down. I simply reached for my phone again, unlocked it, and opened my email. If I wasn't family enough to be there, then I needed to decide exactly what I was willing to be. I stared at the screen for a long moment, my finger hovering just above the first confirmation email. The subject line read, Oceanfront Suite, fully paid. I remembered the day I booked it. I had zoomed in on the photos, studying the view from the balcony, imagining my grandchildren pressed against the glass, pointing at the waves. I had imagined my son standing there too, maybe with a drink in his hand, finally relaxed, finally present. I had built that image carefully, piece by piece, the way you build hope when you don't have much else to hold on to. And now, all of it sat inside a few lines of text, waiting for a single click to disappear. I didn't rush. I opened the email slowly, reading through every detail again, as if I were reviewing someone else's life. Dates. Names. Payment confirmed. Non-refundable after a certain hour that hadn't passed yet. I checked the time in the corner of my screen. Still within the window. Still my decision. That was the part that settled something inside me, not the anger, not even the hurt, but the quiet realization that for once, I was not being reacted to. I was choosing. My phone lit up again. This time, it was a message from my daughter-in-law in the family group chat. A photo. I opened it. She had laid out matching outfits for the kids on their bed, bright, coordinated, ready for pictures. The caption read, Family trip prep Blueheart can't wait to make memories with the people who matter most. I looked at the words carefully. The people who matter most. It wasn't what she said that struck me. It was what she didn't need to say. My name wasn't there. It hadn't been for a while. Below the photo, my son had replied with a simple heart emoji. No hesitation. No correction. Just quiet agreement. I set the phone down gently, almost respectfully, as if I were putting something to rest. For years, I had filled in the gaps for them, excused the silences, softened the edges of things that didn't quite feel right. They're busy. They didn't mean it. I'm overthinking. But sitting there, in the stillness of my kitchen, those explanations felt thin. Worn out. Like excuses I had outgrown without realizing it. I clicked back to the email. At the bottom, there it was, modify or cancel reservation. I read the policy one last time, not because I needed to, but because I wanted to be certain. Not emotional. Not impulsive. Just certain. My husband used to say that the strongest decisions are the quiet ones, the ones you don't announce, the ones you don't explain. You just make them, and you live with them. I think I finally understood what he meant. I clicked cancel. A small window popped up, asking me to confirm. I didn't hesitate. One reservation gone. Then another. The flights took a little longer. I had to go through a separate portal, enter the booking number, verify my identity. The system asked if I was sure. I checked the box. Yes. I am sure. The confirmation screen appeared with a brief message. Your booking has been successfully cancelled. No drama. No sound. Just a quiet end to something that had once meant so much more. I moved on to the next one. And the next. Each cancellation felt less like an act of revenge and more like a correction. Like I was slowly removing myself from a place I had already been pushed out of. By the time I reached the last reservation, the Dolphin Tour, I paused for just a second. I could almost hear my grandson's voice, the way he used to get excited about things like that. I closed my eyes briefly, then clicked anyway. When it was done, I leaned back in my chair and looked around the kitchen. Nothing had changed. The same cabinets. The same quiet hum of the refrigerator. But something inside me had. I wasn't waiting anymore. I wasn't hoping they'd make room for me. I had finally stopped trying to earn a place that should have been mine all along. And somewhere, far away from this quiet house, they were still packing for a trip that no longer existed. The next morning came quietly, almost too quietly for something that should have felt like a breaking point. Sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, landing in the same spot it always did, as if nothing had shifted in the world. I stood there with my coffee, untouched, growing cold in my hands, and for a moment, I wondered if I had imagined everything. If maybe I had overreacted. That old instinct, to question myself before questioning them, hadn't disappeared overnight. It lingered, like a habit worn into the bones. I walked back to the table, my eyes drifting to the empty chair across from me. My husband used to sit there every morning, reading the paper, making quiet comments about things that didn't really matter but somehow made the day feel fuller. You always give more than they deserve, he told me once, not harshly, just as a simple observation. At the time, I had smiled it off. That was what love looked like to me, giving, adjusting, making room. But standing there now, I began to wonder if I had mistaken tolerance for love, silence for peace. My phone buzzed sharply against the table, pulling me out of the thought. This time, it was my son. His name lit up the screen, and for a brief second, something inside me tightened, not hope exactly, but something close enough to it. I let it ring once before answering. Mom? His voice came through strained, rushed. There's a problem with the reservations. The airline says our tickets were cancelled. The hotel can't find our booking. What's going on? I didn't respond right away. I could hear the noise behind him, announcements echoing through what sounded like an airport terminal, the faint chatter of people moving around him. He was already there. Bags packed. Family in tow. Expecting everything to be exactly as I had arranged it. I cancelled them, I said finally, my voice even, steady in a way that surprised even me. There was a pause. Not long, but long enough for the words to settle in. You, what? His tone shifted, confusion sharpening into something else. Why would you do that? We're standing here, Mom. The kids are here. I walked slowly to the sink, setting my cup down without looking away from the window. Outside, the street was still empty, the same quiet rhythm of a morning that belonged only to me now. Your wife didn't want me there, I said. You told me to stay home. Another pause. This one heavier. That's not, Mom, you're taking it the wrong way. She meant exactly what she said, I interrupted, not raising my voice, not rushing the words. And you agreed. On the other end, I could hear movement, a shift in the background, like he had stepped away from the others. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. You didn't have to cancel everything. You could have just, not come. I let that sentence sit between us. It was simple. Honest. And it said more than anything else he had tried to explain. I closed my eyes for just a moment, feeling the weight of it, not as a fresh wound, but as something finally understood. That's exactly the point, I said quietly. If I'm not welcome enough to be there, then I'm not responsible for making it happen. He exhaled sharply, frustration slipping through now. This is going to cost us a lot of money to fix. I almost smiled at that. Not out of amusement, but recognition. Of what mattered. Of what didn't. Yes, I said. It will. And for the first time in a very long while, I didn't feel the need to soften it, to fix it, or to carry the weight of someone else's disappointment. The line went quiet after that. Not completely, there were still sounds in the background, muffled voices, the distant echo of airport announcements, but between us, there was nothing. No apology. No attempt to understand. Just silence stretching thin over something that had already been broken long before this moment. Mom, this is really unfair, he said finally, his voice tighter now, edged with frustration instead of confusion. You should have talked to me before doing something like this. I leaned against the counter, letting his words settle without interrupting. Unfair. That was the word he chose. Not hurtful. Not wrong. Just inconvenient. I did talk to you, I replied quietly. I listened when you told me to stay home. There was a pause again, longer this time, as if he didn't quite know how to respond to that. In the distance, I heard a child's voice, my grandson, asking something I couldn't make out. For a brief second, my chest tightened. Not with regret, but with something softer. A memory, maybe. The sound of him laughing in my living room, building towers out of blocks while I sat on the floor beside him. Those moments hadn't been fake. They just hadn't been enough to protect what came after. We'll figure something out, my son muttered, more to himself than to me. I'll call the airline again. Maybe there's something they can do. I didn't respond to that. I knew the policies. I had read every line. This wasn't a mistake that could be undone with a polite conversation and a credit card. This was final. Intentional. He let out a breath, and when he spoke again, his tone had changed, quieter, but not softer. You didn't have to make a point like this. That sentence stayed with me. Not because it hurt, but because it clarified something I had been trying to understand for a long time. To him, this was a point. A reaction. Something emotional. But to me, it wasn't any of those things. It was a decision. A boundary I had never allowed myself to draw before. I'm not making a point, I said. I'm stepping out of something I was never really part of. He didn't answer right away. And in that silence, I realized something I hadn't fully accepted until now. He wasn't going to defend me. Not to his wife. Not even to himself. Whatever version of me existed in his life now, it was smaller. Optional. Easy to set aside. We'll talk about this later, he said eventually, his voice already pulling away, distracted, as if the conversation had become something he needed to manage, not feel. I have to handle this right now. Of course, I said. And this time, I meant it. The call ended with a soft click, and I set the phone down on the counter without looking at it again. The kitchen returned to its quiet rhythm, unchanged on the surface, but something underneath had settled into place. For years, I had tried to stay connected by giving more time, more patience. more understanding. But standing there, in the stillness of my own home, I finally understood something simple and undeniable: connection doesn't grow where you're not wanted. And for the first time, I wasn't trying to fix that. That afternoon passed slowly, but not heavily the way I might have expected. There was no dramatic collapse, no moment where I sat down and cried into my hands. Instead, everything felt still, measured. I moved through the house the same way I always did, but with a quiet awareness that something fundamental had shifted. I folded a blanket in the living room. I wiped down the kitchen counters that were already clean. I opened the refrigerator, stared for a moment, then closed it again without taking anything out. It wasn't sadness that filled the space, it was clarity. The kind that doesn't come all at once, but settles in piece by piece until you can't ignore it anymore. For years, I had told myself that keeping the peace was the same as keeping the family together. That if I stayed patient, stayed kind, stayed available, things would naturally fall back into place. But looking back now, I could see how often keeping the peace had really meant staying silent when I was being pushed aside. How many times I had adjusted my expectations just to remain included in small, shrinking ways. A shorter visit. A delayed invitation. A seat at the edge instead of at the table. It hadn't happened overnight. It had happened gradually, so quietly that I had almost convinced myself it was normal. My phone remained still on the counter for most of the day. No new messages. No follow-up from my son. I imagined them at the airport, trying to fix what couldn't be fixed, frustration building as each call led to the same answer. Part of me wondered if he would call again, not to argue, but to understand. But that part of me felt smaller now, less insistent. I wasn't waiting the way I used to. Late in the afternoon, I stepped outside onto the small front porch. The air was warm, carrying the faint scent of cut grass from somewhere down the street. A neighbor waved as she walked her dog, and I returned the gesture with a small smile. Life, it seemed, had no intention of pausing just because something inside mine had changed. And maybe that was a good thing. I sat down on the porch chair, resting my hands in my lap, and let the quiet settle around me. It was different from loneliness. Loneliness used to feel like something pressing in on me, something I needed to escape. This felt chosen. Like space I was finally allowing myself to have. I thought about the years behind me, the birthdays I planned, the dinners I hosted, the times I showed up early and stayed late just to make sure everyone else was comfortable. None of those things were mistakes. They were acts of love. But love, I was beginning to understand, wasn't meant to be one-sided. It wasn't meant to be something you proved over and over just to earn a place that should have already been yours. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard, and I realized something simple but steady: I hadn't lost my family in a single phone call or a canceled trip. I had been losing my place in it for a long time. The difference now was that I had finally stopped pretending otherwise. That evening, as the light faded completely and the house settled into its familiar nighttime quiet, my phone finally rang again. I was in the bedroom this time, folding a set of sheets I hadn't really needed to wash. I paused, the fabric still in my hands, and looked at the screen. It was my son. For a moment, I just let it ring, not out of hesitation, but because I no longer felt that immediate urgency to answer. When I did pick up, I didn't speak first. I let him decide how this conversation would begin. "Mom," he said, and this time there was no edge in his voice. Just exhaustion. We had to come back home. I didn't react outwardly, but I could picture it, the luggage still packed, the children confused, the plans unraveling faster than they could be explained. There were no flights available today that we could afford, he continued. And the hotel, they said everything's booked out for the week. We tried everything. I sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, smoothing the sheet across my lap without really looking at it. "I see," I said, my voice calm, unchanged. There was a pause on the other end, as if he was waiting for something more. Maybe sympathy. Maybe regret. "The kids are upset," he added, quieter now. "They don't understand what happened. That was the first sentence that lingered. Not because it shifted anything, but because it revealed where his focus still was. Not on what had been said to me. Not on what had led to this. Just the aftermath. The inconvenience. They were looking forward to it, he said. I nodded to myself, even though he couldn't see it. I know, I replied. And I did. That was the part that hadn't been easy. Not the cancellations. Not the phone call. But the knowledge that somewhere in all of this, the children were caught in something they didn't create. Still, I stayed where I was. I didn't move toward guilt. I didn't reach for an apology that wasn't mine to give. You could have just talked to me, he said after a moment, softer now, but still holding on to that same thread. I let out a quiet breath. I listened, I said. You told me not to come. You told me I wasn't part of it. He was quiet again. Longer this time. And in that silence, something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough for me to notice. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its certainty. She didn't mean it like that, he said, though it sounded more like something he needed to believe than something he was sure of. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I simply said, but that's how it was said. The room around me felt steady, grounded in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. No tension. No need to defend myself. Just truth, laid out plainly between us. So what now? He asked finally, the question hanging there without direction. I looked down at my hands, resting quietly in my lap, and for the first time, I didn't feel like I was searching for an answer that would bring everything back to the way it used to be. That's up to you, I said. And I meant it. Because for once, I wasn't the one trying to hold everything together. That night, after the call ended, I didn't turn on the television or reach for a book the way I usually did. I just sat there in the quiet. Letting his last question echo in my mind. So what now? It was a simple question, but for the first time, it didn't feel like something I had to answer for him. For so many years, what now had always been my responsibility. I was the one who smoothed things over, who made the next call, who planned the next gathering, who filled in the silence before it could grow uncomfortable. But sitting there in that dimly lit room, I realized I wasn't doing that anymore. I wasn't reaching. I wasn't fixing. I was just still. And strangely, that stillness didn't feel empty. It felt earned. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Not because I had somewhere to be, but because my mind was clear in a way it hadn't been in years. I made myself breakfast, nothing elaborate, just toast and eggs, and sat down at the table without rushing. No checking my phone between bites. No waiting for a message that might or might not come. Just a quiet morning that belonged entirely to me. Around mid-morning, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text. Not from my son, but from her. My daughter-in-law. I looked at her name on the screen for a moment before opening it. I think this situation got out of hand. The kids are really disappointed. We didn't expect you to react like this. I read it once. Then again. Not to understand it, but to feel the weight of what was being said, and what wasn't. There was no acknowledgement of the message she had sent through my son. No recognition of the words that started all of this. Just the outcome. The inconvenience. The disappointment, filtered through the children, as if that would soften it. I placed the phone down on the table and took a sip of my coffee before responding. Not immediately. Not emotionally. Just deliberately. You told me I wasn't welcome. I believed you. I stared at the message for a second before hitting send. No explanation. No added weight. Just the truth, simple and complete. A few minutes passed before the typing dots appeared. Then disappeared. Then appeared again. I didn't watch them closely. I had already said what needed to be said. When her reply finally came through, it was shorter. That's not what I meant. I nodded to myself, almost gently. That sentence felt familiar. I had said it myself many times over the years, on their behalf, in their absence. Rewriting moments that didn't sit right. Softening edges that didn't need to be softened. But now, reading it from her, it didn't carry the same weight. It felt empty. Because meaning isn't just what you intend. It's what you say. It's what you allow. It's what you stand by. I didn't respond again. Not because I didn't have something to say, but because I no longer felt the need to continue a conversation that circled around the truth without ever touching it. Instead, I stood up, rinsed my cup, and placed it carefully in the sink. Outside, the day had already begun to move forward. Cars passing. Neighbors going about their routines. Life continuing, steady and indifferent. And for the first time in a long while, I wasn't trying to catch up to it. I was moving with it, at my own pace. Not as someone waiting to be included, but as someone who had finally stopped asking for permission to belong. By the afternoon, the silence between us had settled into something more permanent. Not tense, not waiting to be filled, just there, like a door that had quietly closed without anyone announcing it. I went about my day without checking my phone every few minutes, without replaying the conversation in my head the way I used to. There was a steadiness to it now, a sense that whatever needed to be understood already had been. Still, around 3 o'clock, my phone rang again. This time, I recognized the number immediately. It was my grandson's tablet. I answered without hesitation. "Grandma," his small voice came through, uncertain, like he wasn't sure what he was allowed to say. I softened instantly, though my voice stayed calm. "Hi, sweetheart." There was a pause, then a quiet question. "Are we still going on the trip?" I closed my eyes for just a second, steadying myself before answering. "No, honey. Not this time." Another pause. I could hear something shifting in the background, maybe a door closing, maybe someone walking away. "Mom said you canceled it," he added, his voice smaller now. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the light stretching across the floor. "Yes," I said gently. "I did." He didn't ask why right away. Children don't always need the full story, they just feel when something is off. "I was really excited," he said after a moment. "Me too," I replied, and that was the truth. Out of everything, this was the only part that still carried weight. Not regret, but a quiet ache. "Did I do something wrong?" he asked suddenly. That question landed differently. Sharper. I sat up straighter, my voice firm in a way it hadn't been all day. "No. Absolutely not. You didn't do anything wrong." There was a small exhale on the other end, like he had been holding that question in for a while. "Then, why didn't you come?" I took a breath, choosing my words carefully. Not to protect myself, but to protect him. "Sometimes, grown-ups make decisions that aren't very kind," I said slowly. "And sometimes, instead of pretending everything is okay, you have to step back." He was quiet, processing that in the simple, honest way children do. "Will we still see you?" he asked. That question didn't come from confusion. It came from fear. And that was something I would never let grow if I could help it. "Of course," I said immediately. "That hasn't changed. I'm still your grandma. That doesn't go away." I heard him shift again, a little more relaxed this time. "Okay," he said. I didn't want you to be mad at me." I smiled softly, even though he couldn't see it. "I could never be mad at you," I said. And I meant it more than anything else I had said all day. We talked for another minute, about something small, something simple, before the call ended. When I set the phone down, I didn't feel shaken. I didn't feel pulled back into anything I had already stepped away from. If anything, that call had made something clearer. The problem had never been love. Not mine. Not his. It was everything built around it, the choices, the silences, the things that were allowed to happen without being questioned. And for the first time, I understood that protecting what mattered didn't always mean staying. Sometimes, it meant knowing exactly when to step back, and who you were stepping back for. The evening settled in. Again, quieter than the night before, but not heavier. If anything, it felt clearer. I stood by the window for a while, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one, casting long shadows across the pavement. There was something steady about it, the way the world continued without asking permission, without waiting for things to be resolved. And for once, I wasn't trying to resolve anything. I had said what needed to be said. I had done what needed to be done. The rest wasn't mine to carry anymore. Around 7, my phone rang again. I already knew who it was before I looked. My son. I let it ring twice before answering, not out of hesitation, but because I no longer felt the need to rush toward him. "Mom," he said, his voice quieter this time, stripped of the frustration from before. "Can we talk?" I walked slowly into the living room and sat down, keeping my tone even. "We are talking." There was a brief pause, then a sigh on his end. "I've been thinking about everything," he said. "About what happened, about what I said." I didn't interrupt. I didn't fill the silence for him. I let him sit in it. "It wasn't right," he admitted finally. "Telling you to stay home like that. I shouldn't have said it that way." I listened carefully. Not just to the words, but to what they carried. It wasn't a full apology. Not yet. But it was closer than anything he had offered before. "It wasn't just how you said it," I replied calmly. "It was what you meant." That stopped him. I could feel it, even through the phone. "I didn't mean that you're not family," he said quickly, almost defensively. It would have been easier if things were less complicated." I let that settle. Easier. That word again. I looked around the room, the same room where I had spent years hosting dinners, wrapping gifts, creating moments that were meant to bring us closer. "I was never meant to be easy," I said quietly. "I was meant to be your mother." There was no anger in my voice. No accusation. Just truth. And sometimes, truth lands heavier when it isn't forced. He didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice had shifted again, softer now, uncertain. "She feels like you don't like her," he said. I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was familiar. How quickly things turned, how easily the focus moved away from what had been done and onto how someone felt about it. "This isn't about whether I like her," I said. "This is about whether I'm respected." Another silence followed. Not uncomfortable. Just honest. "I didn't think of it that way," he admitted. And for the first time in this entire conversation, that felt real. Not an excuse. Not a defense. Just a gap in understanding finally being acknowledged. I leaned back slightly, my hand resting against the arm of the chair. "That's the problem," I said gently. "You didn't think of it at all." He exhaled slowly, and I could hear something in that breath, something loosening, something he hadn't wanted to face before. "I don't know how to fix this," he said. I nodded to myself, even though he couldn't see it. "You don't fix it all at once," I replied. "You start by seeing it clearly." The conversation didn't resolve everything. There was no sudden reconciliation, no perfect ending tied neatly in a bow. But when the call ended, it felt different from the others. Not because everything was better, but because, for the first time, something had actually been understood. And sometimes, that's where change begins, not with grand gestures, but with the quiet moment someone finally stops looking away. The next few days passed without urgency, but not without meaning. There were no dramatic confrontations, no long messages trying to explain everything all at once. Just small shifts. Subtle ones. The kind you might miss if you weren't paying attention, but I was. I had learned to notice the quiet things. On the third morning, my phone buzzed with a message from my son. Not a call this time. Just a text. "Hey. I was thinking maybe we could come by this weekend. Just us. No big plans." I read it slowly, not because it was confusing, but because of what it represented. For years, visits had been scheduled around convenience, around what worked best for them. Holidays rotated. Time divided. Presents negotiated. But this felt different. Not a demand. Not an assumption. A suggestion. I didn't answer right away. I made my coffee first, sat down at the table, and let the message sit there while the morning unfolded around me. The sunlight came in through the window, landing on the same spot it always had, steady and unchanged. It reminded me that not everything needed to be rushed. When I finally replied, I kept it simple. You're welcome to come. No extra warmth. No coldness either. Just the truth. Later that afternoon, there was another message, this time from her. My daughter-in-law. It was shorter than I expected. I know things didn't go well. I think we should talk when we come. I read it once, then set the phone down without responding. Not out of avoidance, but because I understood something now that I hadn't before. Not every message requires an immediate reply. Not every situation needs to be smoothed over quickly. Some things need to sit. To breathe. To be faced in person, without the distance of a screen to soften the edges. Saturday came quietly. I didn't clean the house top to bottom the way I used to before they visited. I didn't prepare a full meal or set the table hours in advance. I made a simple lunch. Enough for everyone, but not more than necessary. When the doorbell rang, I walked to it at a normal pace. No rush. No anticipation that needed to be managed. I opened the door, and there they were. My son stood slightly behind his wife, the children between them. The kids smiled first, stepping forward without hesitation, wrapping their arms around me in that natural, unfiltered way only children can. I returned the embrace gently, holding on to that moment just long enough to remind myself what was still real. When I looked up, my son met my eyes. Not quickly. Not casually. He held the look, just for a second longer than usual. There was something there, not fully formed, not yet spoken, but present. Awareness, maybe. Behind him, she stood quieter than I had ever seen her. No polished smile. No easy words. Just stillness. I stepped aside and let them in. No speech. No performance. Just space. As they walked into the house, I realized something important. This wasn't about returning to what we had before. That version was gone. This was something else entirely. Something slower. More deliberate. Something that would only exist if it was built differently this time. And for the first time, I wasn't afraid of that. That afternoon didn't unfold with raised voices or dramatic confessions. It moved quietly, almost carefully, as if everyone in the room understood that something fragile was being handled. The children settled in first, their laughter filling the space in a way that felt familiar, grounding. I watched them from the kitchen as I poured lemonade into glasses, noticing how easily they moved through the house, as if nothing had changed. And in some ways, for them, nothing had. Love, at that age, doesn't calculate. It doesn't measure distance or weigh words. It simply exists. And that reminded me of something important. What was broken here wasn't everything. Just the parts that had been neglected for too long. My son stood near the doorway for a while before finally stepping into the kitchen. He didn't sit down right away. He just stood there, his hands resting lightly against the back of a chair, as if he wasn't sure whether he had fully earned a place at the table yet. "Mom," he said, and this time, there was no rush in his voice. No distraction. Just presence. I turned to face him, not with expectation, but with calm. "I've been thinking about what you said," he continued. "About not seeing it. About not really thinking." He paused, searching for something more honest than convenient. "I think I got used to things being easy. To you making things easy." I didn't interrupt. I let him finish, the way I wish he had done for me more times than I could count. It shouldn't have been your job to make everything work, he said finally. And it definitely shouldn't have come at the cost of you feeling like you didn't belong. That was the closest he had come to understanding, not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to matter. I nodded once, not as approval, but as acknowledgement. It's not about perfection, I said quietly. It's about awareness. He held that for a moment, then gave a small, almost uncertain nod in return. Across the room, his wife stood near the window, quieter than I had ever seen her. When our eyes met, she didn't look away this time. I didn't realize how it sounded, she said, her voice measured, without the polish I was used to. Or how it would land. I studied her for a moment, not searching for guilt, but for sincerity. Words matter, I replied simply. But so does what you allow behind them. She nodded, slowly, as if that truth had finally reached somewhere deeper than before. We didn't solve everything that afternoon. There were no perfect apologies, no sweeping gestures that erased what had happened. But there was something else. Something quieter. A shift. Not in what had been said, but in what was finally being seen. And that, I realized, was where real change begins. Later, after they left, I stood alone in the kitchen again. The same space where I had read that message days before. The same counter, the same window, the same quiet hum of the house. But I wasn't the same woman standing there anymore. I wasn't holding on to what should have been. I wasn't replaying what had hurt. I was simply present. I had spent years believing that love meant staying, no matter how small your place became. That if you gave enough, waited enough, understood enough, things would balance themselves out. But what I learned, what it took me 71 years to fully understand, was this: love without respect isn't connection. It's quiet erasure. And respect doesn't begin when others decide to give it to you. It begins the moment you stop offering yourself to spaces where you're not truly wanted. I didn't lose my family that day. I found my place in it. And this time, it wasn't one I had to earn.